Think about the last time you avoided something for hours, maybe even days. Then you finally started. And 30 seconds later, you thought, why did I wait so long to do this? That moment is your brain updating its prediction. The task wasn't the problem, the starting was. There's another perspective that approaches motivation from a different direction. Instead of asking, how do I force myself to do this? The suggestion is to ask, last night you might have stared at something you needed to do. And if you're honest, you probably already knew what you should do, but somehow your brain still said, not now. And for a moment, you probably thought, why is starting this so hard? Maybe a workout, a project, an email, or something you've been putting off, and thought, I'll start when I feel ready. And somehow, the moment where you finally feel ready never quite arrives. Hours pass, maybe even days, and strangely, the longer you wait, the harder the task starts to feel. Here's the surprising part. The biggest lie about motivation is that you need it before you start. In reality, motivation often appears after the first step, which raises a strange question. Why does the brain suddenly cooperate after you start, but resist so strongly before you begin? Because before you begin, the brain is making a prediction about how painful the task will be. And strangely, that prediction is usually wrong. By the end of this episode, that question will make sense. And once you understand it, you'll see how a simple rule can quietly change how you approach everything. Start before you're ready. Most people think their problem is motivation, but most of the time that's not actually the problem. The real missing ingredient is momentum. Motivation feels like something that should come before starting. Momentum is what happens after movement begins. And the brain responds very differently to those two things. When nothing is happening, the brain predicts effort and discomfort. But once movement begins, even in a tiny way, the brain detects progress. The progress signal starts building momentum. And momentum is often what people are experiencing when they say, now I'm motivated. So the sequence most people imagine looks like this: motivation, action. But in real life, it usually works like this: action, momentum, motivation, which means the feeling that people are waiting for is the very action they're avoiding. Imagine someone who wants to work out. They tell themselves, I'll go when I feel motivated. But the day goes by and motivation never arrives. The next day, the task feels even heavier. Not because the workout got harder, because the brain is learning that avoiding the workout gives relief. And relief feels good. So the brain quietly learns, avoiding, this is rewarding. And almost everyone knows the strange moment that follows. The task feels enormous before you begin, but surprisingly manageable the moment you start. Before we get into the brain science, pause for a second. Notice what usually happens the moment you start something that you've been avoiding. The tension drops a little, the task suddenly looks a little smaller, and the brain quietly goes, oh, this is manageable. That tiny shift is a clue to what's happening inside the brain. Here's where it gets interesting. Motivation is deeply connected to the brain's dopamine system. Think of it as a progress and anticipation signal. Your brain releases dopamine when it detects movement towards a goal, signs of progress, possibility of a reward, which means something important. Your brain doesn't just reward thinking about doing things. Another system is involved, the anterior cingulate cortex, which estimates effort versus reward. Before you start a task, it often overestimates the effort, which is why starting can feel heavier than the task itself. In other words, the brain simulates the task before it happens, and the simulation is often exaggerated. So internally, the brain predicts something like this: this will be exhausting, complicated, and annoying, which creates resistance. But the moment you start, the brain gets real data instead of imagined effort. And very often, the prediction updates quickly. That's why people frequently have the same experience. Oh, this isn't actually that bad. A useful way to remember this is your brain is much worse at predicting effort than performing effort. It responds much more strongly to actually starting. Even a small action can shift the brain's prediction from this is effort and pain to, oh, something's happening here. The shift can increase motivation. So the sequence often becomes action, dopamine, momentum, motivation, not the other way around. Waiting for motivation creates a hidden loop, like the belief, I need to feel ready first. So you delay. When you delay, you feel relief. And relief teaches the brain avoidance works, which makes the task feel heavier next time. So the brain becomes even less motivated to start. This is why sometimes people feel like motivation is disappearing. But in reality, the brain is just learning from behavior. Instead of asking, how do I get motivated? Try asking a different question. What is the smallest version of starting? Because the brain responds to movement, not perfection. You don't need to finish the task. You just need to break the inertia. Motivation is often the side effect of motion. And you've probably experienced this yourself. Think about the last time you avoided something for hours, maybe even days. Then you finally started. And 30 seconds later, you thought, why did I wait so long to do this? That moment is your brain updating its prediction. The task wasn't the problem, the starting was. There's another perspective that approaches motivation from a different direction. Instead of asking, how do I force myself to do this? The suggestion is to ask, what is the most exciting thing I can do right now? In that framework, excitement isn't just a random emotion. It's treated like an internal compass. Not necessarily intense excitement, sometimes just curiosity. This seems interesting. Let me try this. I want to explore that. Following that small spark naturally leads to action. And once action begins, something familiar happens. Action, momentum, motivation. So from this perspective, excitement isn't the same as motivation. It's more like the starting signal that gets movement going. And the movement is what allows motivation to grow. Whether someone approaches this from neuroscience or a more philosophical point of view, the pattern looks surprisingly similar. Small curiosity, action, momentum, motivation. Which means the question isn't, how do I force myself to do this? But simply, what's the smallest thing I could act on right now that feels even a little interesting? Try this for the next few days. When you catch yourself waiting to feel motivated, do 2 minutes of the task. That's it. Not the full workout, not the whole project, not the entire life overall. Just 2 minutes. Then observe what happens. Does resistance drop after starting? Does clarity increase? Does motivation show up after you begin? Treat it like an experiment. Your brain will show you the answer. Earlier in this episode, we asked a question. Why does the brain resist so strongly before you start, but cooperate once you begin? Now you know the answer. Before you start, your brain is running a prediction about effort. And that prediction is often exaggerated. But the moment you begin, the brain receives real evidence instead of imagined effort. The evidence creates progress signals. Progress creates momentum, and momentum often becomes motivation. So if you take one idea from this episode, let it be this. Your brain isn't actually stopping you from starting. It's trying to protect you from an imagined future. Before you begin, the brain runs a simulation of the task. And very often, that simulation predicts far more effort, frustration, and discomfort than what actually happens. So the resistance you feel isn't always reality. It's often a prediction error, which reveals something deeper about the human mind. Most of the barriers we experience exist first as prediction, not as reality, which means something important. The life people are waiting to feel ready for is often locked behind a prediction their brain hasn't updated yet. And the only way the brain updates prediction is through movement. Your brain doesn't reward intention, it rewards action. So instead of waiting for motivation, try creating the smallest possible amount of motion. 2 minutes, just enough to give your brain real evidence, instead of imagined effort. Because once motion exists, momentum can begin. And momentum is often what motivation feels like after you start.